Okay,
Okay.
well, welcome to you all. And as you can see, my talk today is going to be about Hal Wyn. If you do have any questions, I'll put them in the chat and I'll try and answer them at the end. Right, so once again, we'll try to go from the slideshow and hopefully you can see that once again. Okay, so Hal Wyn was the bardic name of Rolf St Vincent Allin-Collins, and he was one of the major people involved in the Cornish language revival during the 1920s and 1930s, and a very enigmatic figure, not easy to find out information about. And these days, he's not well known at all. However, in the 1920s and 1930s, he was a very prominent figure, and he became very controversial. And as you can see from the comments made by various people about him, either in articles or books or private letters, you can see there's quite a range of ideas there. And I hope by the end of this talk, we can understand him a bit more. We'll look at what he did and what he said, how his family history has coloured his life, how he was treated by the rest of the Cornish community, and how all of this has had a profound effect on the nature of Cornish today. Okay, firstly, just a few details about the Cornish language. It's a Celtic language, part of the Brythonic branch, along with Welsh and Breton. And gradually the language retreated to the far west of the Penwith Peninsula, to the west of Penzance, where the last first language speakers died out at the end of the 1700s. Succeeding generations, although they may have spoken Cornish as a second language, possessed less and then less of the language until in the 1870s, Henry Jenner and Władysław Lach set about collecting what people knew and then putting it together. And then in 1904, Henry Jenner published his Handbook of the Cornish Language, and that's generally acknowledged as being when the Cornish Revival started. Okay, first, if we look at the life of Cornish, we can see that it can be conveniently divided into four parts. There's Old Cornish, Middle Cornish, Tudor Cornish, and Late Cornish, and each has their own literature and grammatical features. The literature of Old Cornish is very scanty, being confined more or less to lists of words with Latin glosses. Middle Cornish is typified by miracle plays, and you can see there's a couple named there, and therefore it's found mostly in verse form. Tudor Cornish contains saints' lives like Bunan's Meriatic and the sermons of John Tregear, and Late Cornish is found mostly in letters, in extracts from the Bible, and other prose forms. And altogether, the traditional literature of Cornish totals about 180,000 words. Now, Henry Jenner based his revival of the language on the language in its late form. That's why I put the blue bar underneath Late Cornish. And he was taking up the language where it left off, as it were. And his orthography is similar to that used by Edward Llwyd in 1707. The period Hal Wyn is active is from 1924 to 1938, a period shown in red in the diagram, and a period when unified Cornish was divided by Robert Morton Nance. You can see a picture of them there in the middle, and it was adopted by the rest of the community. And unified Cornish used Middle Cornish as its base, which is why it's situated underneath there. Now, gradually, others with an interest in the language collected fragments from the old people they met, or they learnt Cornish from Henry Jenner's book. By 1924, there were a number of other fluent speakers of the language. They include Richard Hall, and that's actually not a picture of Richard Hall, it's a picture of his brother, but I couldn't find a picture of Richard Hall himself. And he'd learnt phrases when he was a child from his grandmother and from his family's maid in the 1860s. There's Robert Walling, who wrote the first ever Cornish magazine while convalescing in hospital with wounds suffered in the First World War. William Watson, and he had met several people with traditional knowledge of the language before Jenner published his book. And then there was Robert Morton Nance, an artist from a Cornish family who was brought up in South Wales. Now, Nance gradually established himself as the chief authority in the language, and he became disenamored by Jenner's late-based orthography, and he was quite a medievalist, really, and so he wished to base Cornish orthography on the language used in the Ordinalia in the 1390s, 1400s. Now, on February the 23rd, 1924, Trelawney Roberts gave a lecture to the London Cornish Association. It included contributions from a number of others, reading poetry and so on. And there was a postcard read out from Robert Morton Nance's 11-year-old daughter, Phoebe, written in Cornish. And that was read out to the audience there. And it's presumed that Rolf Allin-Collins went to the lecture and became reconnected somehow with his Cornish roots. He was already a fluent speaker of Irish and a competent Welsh speaker. And by October 1825, he'd started corresponding with Robert Morton Nance, to start with in a mixture of English and Cornish, but later on only in Cornish or sometimes in Breton as well. So let's examine firstly why we're interested in Hal Wyn, in Rolf St Vincent Allin-Collins. And there's three main reasons for our interest. Firstly, Hal Wyn was the most fluent speaker of his age. Despite his deep knowledge of the language, Robert Morton Nance wasn't a confident speaker, as we can see from the quote from Professor Nicholas Williams. By then, Henry Jenner was old and in his dotage, really. The two other really fluent speakers were William Watson, and he was famous from working class stock and was basically ignored by class-conscious people like Henry Jenner, and Richard Hall. And Richard Hall had moved to South Africa. They would occasionally travel to London, where Allin-Collins ran a class and conversation group every Thursday evening. And learners such as E.G.R. Hooper, or Talek was his bardic name, he was a future grand bard. They would make it their way to his classes to learn how to speak fluent Cornish. A.S.D. Smith, or Caradar, who came to Cornwall in 1933, he was also a very fluent speaker, but he definitely preferred the written language, and he didn't really see a future in the language being spoken. As we can see the quote from A.S.D. Smith's book, The Story of the Cornish Language. Now, secondly, Hal Wyn, or Rolf Allin-Collins, was the most prolific writer of the 1920s and 1930s. Jenner had written very little in Cornish, and some of what he'd written was never published. So Allin-Collins' stories and translations and newspaper articles were amongst the first works in print in the Cornish Revival. Now, you can see a list of them there, of course. Now, he wrote as much as Robert Morton Nance did in a third of the time. So we've got a list here of people who've contributed more than 50,000 words to the corpus of Cornish literature up to the present day. And it wasn't really up to the 1980s that anyone wrote significantly more than he had done. In fact, Rod Lyon's translation of Treasure Island in 1981 and Melva Bonetto's original novel and Gorno Wysickelty in 1984 were the first long Cornish works. The third major reason, and most importantly for himself and the direction that the revival took, he stated in an article in the Zeitschrift for Celtic Philology that he was a native speaker of Cornish. And indeed, he'd been claiming this in letters since early 1927. So it wasn't just the first time that he'd said this, but it was the first time it'd been published. And this caused consternation amongst the revivalists, because if it were true, it would have meant that it would have placed him above Jenner and Nance, all of whom had learned the language as a second language. So it was a direct threat to Nance's status as the head of the revival, and with Jenner, of course, being a very old man. So letters were sent to prominent Celticists and to academics decrying Allin-Collins' work and saying that his writings were without authority. So what did Allin-Collins actually say in the article? And can we come to any conclusion about the veracity of his statements? I've tried to color code some of the statements here. So he said in yellow that his father was born in 1841 in Heatham in Cornwall and was more or less self-taught. In orange, he said that both his father and grandfather are reputed to be very strong. In the red, he said that he was born in 1878 and he was taken to Picardy in France, a village called Wiccarden, when he was only a year old. In the green, that he'd begun to learn English when he was 12 years old, so he hadn't spoken any English before that. And then in the blue, he was taught some Cornish, both by his father and by his mother and by others, for example, a servant called Emma Trewin, none of whom had learned it from books. Now, some of these statements are impossible to prove. So what I'd like to do a bit later on is to see, can we see whether the statements that can be proved are true? And then if he's telling the truth in one place, it's more likely that he's telling the truth in other places as well. Okay, so before examining the life of Ralph St Vincent Allin-Collins, it's useful to see how his name changes over time. And you can see that he didn't use the name Collins until 1915 on his marriage certificate. So now what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at Ralph Allin-Collins' family history and see whether the statements that he's made that we just looked at are likely to be the truth, and discover a bit more about the man and how that's coloured how he operated with the rest of the revivalists. Now, his birth certificate reveals that his parents were John Allin and Marie Richmond. We actually found out a bit later that John Henry Allin and Anna Maria Marie Richmond are the full names, but that's what's on the birth certificate. Research into his father's family shows that his father was usually John Henry Allin, and indeed he was born in 1841 at Heatham, north of Kilcampton. And you can see that Heatham is virtually just a farm. And Kilcampton, right in the far north of Cornwall, right on the Devon border. And if we look at the map there, you can see that it's an area that in the height of Cornish in the 1400s was entirely English speaking. Now, we only have Rolf's word via his mother that his father was self-taught. He states, "I've been told by my mother that in his youth, my father's wish was to remain in the fields where he used to pass the time studying English with the help of Dr. Johnson's dictionary. As from his own statement to her, he only went to school for 6 months, as in those days it wasn't compulsory for children to attend school. And so perfect became his command of English that later on he took up literary work and edited various papers." Now, we'll see the significance of this statement later on. The map shows English and Cornish speaking areas in the time period 1250 to 1550. So you can see Heatham is far away from any of the Cornish speaking areas at that time. Now, interesting, we have an example of his father's literary work, and this is a poem supposedly written by John Henry Allin, Rolf's father, when he was 18 years old. You can see it's quite sort of florid language. We won't read it all out. There's a lot of it and fairly boring. We actually have portraits of him as well. And that shows to a flamboyant man full of his own importance, to my way of thinking. I don't know whether you agree with me, but certainly he's an interesting character. Now, John Henry Allin's family tree shows that his mother was called Elizabeth or Betsy Vincent. And presumably this is the source for Rolf's second name, St Vincent, given a bit of extra romanticism, perhaps. Apart from that, there's nothing really of note to be found on this side of the family. And all of the family seem to have been farmers in local farms and hadn't moved at all. Now, no newspaper article could be found naming either John Henry Allin nor his father, John Allin. But Cornish wrestling contests were reported from Kilcampton, so there's no special reason not to believe Rolf's report that his father and grandfather were strong, although I think there's some poetic license in that they could bend a bar of iron with their bare hands. So you can see that there's a bit of over-egging the spoon sort of thing. Now, John Henry and Marie's marriage certificate shows that when they married in 1869 in Westminster in London, John Henry was a draper, and that his father, John Allin, was dead, and Marie's father, James Richmond, still alive. Now, at the next census in 1871, we can find a clue as to Marie's family. John Henry Allin is there at the top. He was a draper, living his wife, Anne M., at 5 Little Pulteney Street, which today is called Brewer Street and is in the middle of Soho in London. And with them is their young daughter, Vivian L., aged 7 months, and John Henry's mother-in-law, Isabella Richmond. And she's married, aged 57, and she was born at Hatch Beecham in Somerset. There's 8 shop assistants, a nurse and a cook, who I've coloured in purple there. So the family seems pretty successful. But below these servants can be found 2 aunts, Louisa Clibborn, married, and Mary L. Collins, unmarried. And both of those were also born in Hatch Beecham in Somerset. So we have our clue as to why Rolf St Vincent Allin decided to use the name Collins later on. So if we look at Marie's family tree, we can see that Isabella was the eldest of 3 daughters, and there was another son, but he died in infancy, of Bonner Collins. And Bonner Collins was the youngest son of John Collins, and John Collins was a wealthy wool merchant of Ilminster in Somerset. And you can see, if we note, who John Collins married as well. Now, John Collins built the Georgian stately home of Hatch Court at Hatch Beecham, and that's near Taunton. You can see the location of it on the map there. Now, John had married into wealth, as we just seen. His wife, Jane Langford, was one of the daughters and heiresses of Jonas Langford, and he had large slave plantations on the Isle of Antigua. And that's Jonas Langford's stately home, Theobald's Park in Hertfordshire. Now, Bonner Collins, of course, was the youngest son, and he had inherited a house, not the Hatch Court, but a house called Belmont near Hatch Court. However, he presumably encountered financial problems because he put his house on the market in 1812. The family, it seems, emigrated to Guernsey because Bonner Collins's wife died there in 1820. You can see the inscription for the gravestone. And he himself was imprisoned in Guernsey for larceny in 1822. And it mentions that he's on the list of debtors there. Now, Bonner Collins eventually died in 1845 at the age of 66. Here's his death certificate or his burial record. Evidently, the family cherished the links to the Collins and Langford families, but the main bulk of the wealth had passed to elder brothers and sisters. But Collins and Langford were used as middle names by a number of the family. So if we go back to the Allin family, we can see that the 2 elder brothers of John Henry, Titus and Richard, and a half-brother by Elizabeth Vincent's first husband are all highlighted in red. Now, they had all made their way up to London to work in the drapery trade. I'm not exactly sure the exact year, but about 1860. Now, John Adams worked as a Manchester warehouseman, so he was the wholesaler, taking stuff from Manchester and then selling mainly linen to his stepbrothers. And the stepbrothers had formed a number of partnerships when they arrived in London. You can see a note here about one partnership between Titus Allin, John Adams, and a Charles Webber had been dissolved as to regards Charles Webber. Now, John Henry opened a shop at 5 Little Pulteney Street, and that had been a draper's business. There had been a draper's business there for years before. So in the 1840s, you can see that list on the right. Joseph Sanders had been operating a linen business there. There's a picture of Little Pulteney Street. I'm not quite sure exactly which date, but late 1800s, I think, there. And John Henry also opened a shop at Edgware Road, and that's where he lived. Titus went to Lambeth Walk, that was south of the Thames, and Richard had shops in Islington and in Hackney. And the map shows how the family had sort of covered the whole of the city with draper shops. So no matter where you live, there was one of the Allin family draper shops near you. And gradually the brothers established themselves. Titus married in 1865, Richard in 1867, John Henry and John Adams in 1869, and they had children. And here we can see John Henry and Marie's children. So Rolf was the youngest of 5 children, and only one of them didn't survive infancy, Claude. And you can see that all of them have middle names. Langford and Collins and St Vincent we've already been able to account for, I don't know the reason for Hendy. So Vivian was born in 1870. So we can see that the word Langford, the name Langford is used in her name. Isabella, that's her death certificate. That's the Marie's mother. She died at the end of 1871. And her father, James Abraham Richmond, died a year later. Now, in 1872, Claude St Vincent Allin was born, but he died after just 7 weeks from tubercular meningitis. 1873, that's when Edith Marie Hendy Allin was born. And for some reason, she was named Florence Marie on the birth certificate. And as I said, we don't know the reason for the Hendy. I haven't been able to find that out yet. And amazingly, we've actually got photographs of her. So this is Edith as a very small child. Also in 1873, John Henry joined the Freemasons, and there's a significance to this later on as well. And about that time, John Henry decided to open up a new shop in Boulogne in France, selling linen. And 1875, Muriel Collins Allen was born in 1875 at Port de Doon in Boulogne-sur-Mer at the end of May, but she was baptized in London in October. So we don't know how well the family spoke French before moving there, but Rolf described how he didn't learn English before the age of 12. So it must have been very difficult juggling work and family between 3 houses and the responsibility of running 3 shops. So the family must have been moving regularly between France and England, because although Muriel was born in Boulogne, the family don't, in 1875, the family don't appear there on the 1876 census, at least not from my searches. It wasn't easy going through all of the census records, they're all handwritten. Now, Rolf was born in Lewisham in 1878. And by 1879, he says he was taken to Boulogne to live at a small hamlet called Wiccarden near Boulogne. We know that by mid-1880, at the latest, John Henry, Rolf's father, was having an affair with a younger woman called Agnes Gertrude Janes, because a son was born to them, Raymond Harmer Ashley. So they wanted to keep it secret, and he had the son under a different name. And Raymond Harmer Ashley was born at the end of March 1881. So by this same year, John Henry Allen bought another house in a suburb of Thornton Heath in the southeast of London. And we've got no way of knowing how much Cornish Rolf's father and mother spoke. I think we can rule out that John Henry's family had always spoken it because of their location in Cornwall, as we've seen from the map evidence. It's possible that John Henry had learnt some when he educated himself, and that he passed some on to Maria, because Maria was from London originally. Rolf says in Zeitschrift for Celtic Philology that his mother taught him a bit. What I've learnt from my mother and others, traditional though it was not much, he says. And that servants, one by the name of Emma Trewin, used to speak sentences apparently of Cornish to him. In the censuses, I've found no trace of these servants. That doesn't mean to say they didn't necessarily exist there. Now, in the 1881 French census in Boulogne, you can see Marie, Edith, Muriel, and Rolf there. Vivian was staying with her uncle Richard Allin in London at that time. And next year, in 1882, the partnership between John Henry and John Adams was dissolved. Perhaps John Henry's secret affair had become known to his brothers, and he decided to cut the links. At any rate, in the next year, in October 1883, John Henry, Rolf's father, emigrated to the USA with Agnes Jeans and their son Raymond, leaving Rolf at the age of 5. And there's a picture of the boat they went on, the Lydian Monarch. And here's a picture of the Harmer Ashley family in America, making a new life for themselves, and Agnes as an older woman. So here is John Henry's family tree, including his new family. Right, the loss of his father must have affected Rolf greatly. And Trelawney Roberts, in a letter to Morton Nance, describes how it was very difficult to get details on Allin-Collins' family and upbringing, And I think we can understand the reason why. And if we look at the notes by Robert Morton Nance, he says, he has at various times claimed to be a native speaker of Russian, Arabic, and probably other languages that he translates professionally. He knows Breton and seems to have learnt French before he knew English, which he still uses as a foreigner would. Well, we'll see other evidence later on to say that that's not necessarily true. Lille, if not his birthplace, seems to have been his childhood home. Well, Lille is not quite Boulogne, but it's still in the Picardy area, isn't it? By the 1886 census, Marie and her children had continued to live in Boulogne, as Rolf had said in his article in Zeitschrift for Celtic Philology. And in 1886, Edith, Muriel, and Ralph were living with Marie. In 1891, they've been joined by Vivian. You can see Marie at the top and then Vivian. And they were living now in Rue Louis Duflos in northern Boulogne. Unfortunately, a possible life-changing event had passed them by. Marie's aunts, Louisa Clibborn and Mary Sophia Langford Collins, had both passed away in 1889. And the notice had been placed in the Times, that's in the red box in the top left, in December 1889, asking for Marie to contact a firm of solicitors in Bath. The estate of £2,555.15 in 1889 is worth about 1.5 million today. Now, Mary had died intestate, so the wealth passed to Isabella Clibborn, one of Louisa's daughters. It's obvious that Marie didn't see the notice because it's repeated 5 years later in a Bath newspaper in the green box at the bottom. So they missed out on a share of £1.5 million, or the equivalent of. And worse was to come, because in 1894, the partnership of John Adams and Titus Allin went bust. And Marie's shop in Boulogne was owed £800. And Richard Allin, Ralph's uncle, owed £68. £800 then is worth about £500,000 today. So they missed out on two major events there, didn't they? Okay. From the beginning of 1891, Marie Allin started advertising her house, which she called Richmond House, as a French Protestant school for young ladies. In the 1891 census, there were 2 pupils from Africa there. Her name is given as Mademoiselle Allin, and by 1899, Mademoiselle Allin de Richemont. So they're again making the name a bit more romantic. The adverts for 1891-92 show that Mademoiselle Allin Vivian was also a teacher there. However, in 1893, Vivian married a clergyman from Preston, Lancashire, Frederick Eugene Perrin. He served in various parishes around England before emigrating to Vancouver with Vivian after World War I. And it's interesting that the adverts for the school emphasized the learning of languages. So Rolf must have been exposed to learning different languages from a very young age. Now, we've got no direct information at all about Rolf between the censuses of 1891 and 1900. But in 1934, he said it was 34 years ago when he visited Russia. So in other words, in 1900. He wrote at least 8 articles on his adventures for the Cornish language magazine Kerno, and one of them is on the left-hand side there. And he also wrote a couple of articles for the St Ives Times in 1934 about that. It seems he entered Russia at Alexandrovo in what's now Poland, and he traveled to southwest Russia, the area now part of western Ukraine, calling it Odessa. And after spending several months there, he went on to Istanbul and spent another few months in an unknown Arab country. In a letter to Morton Nance in 1934, he says he came to England in 1901. Now, John Henry Allin, who fled to America, Rolf's father died in 1904. And he had been the editor of a newspaper for the insurance industry in New York. So intriguingly, we've heard in his article that
for Zeitschrift for Celtic Philology, Rolf does say that his father had edited various papers. Now, one would have thought that John Henry had broken all contact with Marie and the family. So does this refer to a time before he left for America? Or was there some sort of knowledge of where John Henry was and what he was doing with the rest of the family afterwards? We don't know. Now, although I've not been able to trace Marie and her daughters Edith and Muriel in censuses after 1891, this newspaper article seems to indicate that Edith was the victim of a confidence trickster in 1906. Somebody declared he was the Count Emmanuel de Cassert and managed to extort some jewels out of her. So she lost jewels worth perhaps £50,000 in today's currency. Now, Muriel came back to Britain and married in 1911 to an elderly clergyman. And after giving birth to a son in Brittany in 1915, they moved to Herefordshire, and the husband died in 1921. And it's unknown how much contact Rolf kept with his sisters. I've seen no reference at all to them in any of his letters. And I did try to make contact through Ancestry.com with some of the Muriel's descendants, but to no avail. Now, in the years before World War I, we see Rolf in London, and he's working as a translator. And he adopts florid versions of his name, Rolf Allen St Vincent de Richemont, and so on. It can be seen he lived in a number of places, and he had offices to begin with at 65 Fenchurch Street. In a letter to Morton Nance in 1934, he says that he was hired by the British Secret Service during the war. Now, as a translator, that's quite plausible, but I've been unable to find any corroborating evidence. There's no Secret Service files or lists or whatever on the family history websites that have been able to, or National Archives that have been able to go into and find his name there. Here he also relates a familial connection to the Master of Kinloss, the son of the Duke of Buckingham, and so on. That seems fanciful to me. If it is true that his cousin is one of his cousins, it's going to be a very, very distant cousin indeed. Now, in his marriage certificate, we can see that Rolf St Vincent Allin-Collins married Eulalie Marie Momens from Berg near Brussels in Belgium. Usually she was known as Julie in the UK. And she was one of 10 children. She was about fifth or sixth, I think, of sixth of the 10 children. 9 of them were girls. Most had names including Marie, and there was one boy at the end. And when Julie was 17, her mother died in appalling circumstances. I think they were a fairly poor family. Her father was a wheelwright. Her mother ran a pub, and then there was a lot of fights and arguments. And then her father, in front of her, I think all the rest of the family, took out a shotgun and shot his wife in the waist, and she died in a few moments. He received 15 years hard labor, as it says in the little newspaper article down at the bottom. And the children who were minors had to be looked after by the rest of the family. So both Rolf and Julie had both had fairly traumatic childhoods in a way. By the 1921 census, he had relocated his offices to 145, I think it's 145 Fenchurch Street rather than 146, where he remained for the next 20 years or so. So we come back to 1924. This was the situation when he went to the London Cornish Association to see Trelawney Roberts' lecture, and he then became attracted to Cornish. By late 1925, he got in contact with Robert Morton Nance to say he wanted to work on a grammar, and he agreed with him on the need to standardize spelling in 1925. Okay, Nance told him he was already working on a grammar and on a standardized orthography. Now, Morton Nance was too slow a worker for Rolf's taste, so Rolf went ahead and published his grammar early in 1927. He rushed it, and it wasn't an organised book, and it received a very lukewarm review in the magazine Cyrno Goth by Morton Nance. And we can see by this time, in 1927, he was already calling himself Hal Wyn. He had already awarded himself a bardic name, even though he wasn't a bard. And as we can see in the pink, by teaching as a learner and experimenting and experimenting and correcting his own work freely from page to page, he disarms criticism. And if his Cornish isn't always that of a purist, that will perhaps correct himself if his zeal should prove infectious, and young Cornish people allow him to lead them back to the Celtic language as his daily use in speech by himself and his pupils. He then goes on, this is Morton Nance writing now. He says in the yellow, his grammar includes a vast number of English dialect or other non-Celtic or non-Cornish words, to which he gives equal authority with his Cornish of various periods and authenticity. So Nance wanted to cut out a lot of the words that Allin-Collins was using. We'll see what problems this led to a bit later on. Now, ASD Smith's or Caradas take on the matter was also scathing. So we can see in the yellow, Hal Wyn did a lot to interest the London Cornish in the language. He spoke it fluently, and by his own example, banished from the minds of his pupils the idea that Cornish was a dead language. And then the efforts of reviving Cornish were retarded rather than helped by the premature appearance of Hal Wyn's Cornish grammar, the shortcomings of which will be apparent to anyone who knows the language. So damned with faint praise. Okay. Nevertheless, Allin-Collins persisted, and early in 1928 he published a book of short stories under the name Andain Hai Thou Rec, The Man with Two Wives. It was that was a short story written by Morton Nance. And in his copy, Nance comments that Rolfe didn't tell him he was going to publish his story. He didn't get his permission first. Now, in his biography of Morton Nance, Rod Lyon tells us of Nance's character and working methods. So when Allin-Collins objected to words he thought perfectly good Cornish words, and Nance wanted to reject them, and when Nance wanted to reject aspects of the language he thought corrupted by English, there's going to be plenty of opportunities for arguments. You can see that Nance did an immense amount of work on Cornish. He was the only person with the knowledge of the language which was thorough enough and with time to devote to it to be able to synthesize it all and produce a series of dictionaries and grammars. Then pink, his position as the leading expert in language created a problem. As far as Cornish was concerned, Nance was the prosecution, defence, judge, and jury. He was in a position to do with Cornish exactly what he wanted. And that was very unfortunate because what he wanted to do, he gave precedence to things which he thought ought to have been preserved, even though they were even unattested in texts. He produced a language which was overloaded with spellings and grammatical forms that may have been obsolete even in the earliest Cornish texts. So some of the major tenses he was using weren't used after 1300. Anything which smacked of change was classed as corrupt and therefore forbidden. Such excluded forms late Cornish, and indeed they still are. So you can see that Allin-Collins was being sent to Coventry, was being labelled as using a corrupt language, and he shouldn't be. You shouldn't be associating with him. Now, Allin-Collins found out that Nance had been communicating with esteemed professors and Celticists, informing them that Allin-Collins' work was without authority and of poor quality. And here in 1928, Allin-Collins says to D. Rhys Phillips of Swansea University that he's persona non grata with Nance. He also states then that he's always known Cornish. So he kept to the same idea that he had always known Cornish, although he didn't say how much. Now, by now, Allin-Collins spoke fluently a number of languages which he used in his business of translation. He certainly spoke French, English, German, Spanish, Russian, Arabic, which he says he spoke but didn't write, Irish, Cornish, Welsh, and most likely Flemish, because that would have been Julia's home tongue. And there was also passable in Breton. And in August 1928, he was inaugurated as a bard of the Breton Gorsedd, the Breton equivalent of the Welsh Gorsedd, at Loch Maria Caer, 6 weeks before the first ever Cornish Gorsedd was held. And for that, of course, he'd been overlooked because he was persona non grata with Nance and Jenner. His work with Breton was emphasized by the dedication of Apsulio's book, Ses Vloas et Bro and Voriamed, the following year. By 1929, Allin-Collins was preparing a dictionary and another book of short stories and exercises. However, in those days, publishing was a very expensive business. The same year saw the publication at last of Morton Nance's Cornish for All, and in that he set out his unified Cornish spelling based on the medieval language. And the spelling system was enthusiastically received by the rest of the community. Hal Wyn would have to conform to this system, or he'd be on his own, still using Jenner's system. However, as we've seen, Allin-Collins' article in Zeitschrift für Keltische Philology in 1930 really put the cat among the pigeons. Trelawney Roberts wrote a confidential letter to Morton Nance, and Roberts was afraid that Allin-Collins would make a laughingstock of the Cornish Revival. In this part of the letter here, he repeats Hal Wyn's claims about his father and considered why he might say that. He mentions things like self-deception, delusion, and hallucination. He goes on to talk about excessive imagination. And Nance says the idea was evidently put into his head by hearing Cornish for the first time at Trelawney Roberts' meeting, and especially on hearing Phoebe's contribution, which made him think it would be interesting to have known Cornish himself from childhood. Right. Of course, we cannot prove whether that is true or not, can we really? Trelawney Roberts considers there's another possibility, that Mr. Jenner has annoyed him, and so have you, Morton Nance, though you try to be polite to him. If he were to say, I'm a native speaker from birth, and what right have you to question anything I say? In that case, it would be an effective counter to Jenner and Nance. Nance says it would be very easy to disprove his claim by putting a few questions to him. Now, the years following the article's release saw further acrimony, and there's a lot of letters between Allin-Collins and Morton Nance. Here's a taste of a number of quotes from letters from 1930 to 33. Ninsoma perchenek genoeg. I'm not the owner of the language. And then says nahen dain vith and norvis il leverol henna. And there's nobody in the world who can say that. And genoeg mi en scrif del one hegen for del glapiev. The Cornish that I speak, that I write, is what I know from the way I speak. So Hal Wyn's consistently keeping to the same story that he learned some of the language as a child. Here, Allin-Collins is annoyed that Nance wrote to him in English, because Allin-Collins virtually always wrote to him in Cornish. And he's writing in English back to sort of pay him back, as it were. Also in 1933, he was finally, after 5 years, accepted at Cornish Gorsedd as a language bard. And Hal Wyn, in the second quote at the bottom of the page, thought it odd that should have been judged by people with less of a knowledge of Cornish than himself. Until then, Hal Wyn had not been considered for bardship, presumably because he was considered a troublemaker. However, the incongruity of the most fluent speaker and writer not being a bard eventually caused Nance and so on to cave in. Here, Hal Wyn's continuing to be consistent in his claims that he learned some Cornish as a child. When I maintain aloud that Cornish never died, though others disbelieve it, I'm saying what I believe. He believed that he had learned some Cornish as a child. Words cannot be remembered in afterlife that passed almost noticed at the early stage of one's existence. I've never said that our servant girls who spoke Cornish to me and the ancient ones of Mousel taught me Middle Cornish. How could they? yet they spoke their Cornish speech. So he was saying he'd been taught late Cornish by these people. Nance was constantly complaining, it seems, about Hal Wyn's Cornish, about his vocabulary, about his grammar, and his attitude. May I say that although you say that my constructions are difficult to read, you don't say where. You say I've shown very little readiness to work with concert with you. That's unfair, as did I not agree to take your spelling, conform to what you give in Cornish for All with all its many aspects? It's meant much work for me. I'm not aware that I introduce any novelties beyond using what I happen to know is also correct. So he's consistently saying the same thing time after time. He knew Cornish from the beginning. Occasionally, there would be a rapprochement. So today I'm 56, that's in 1934. So I'm glad to say at last my ambition to work closely with you in Cornish is at last realized. However, here, Hal Wyn was saying that his expenditure on Cornish and publishing and so on was costing him lots of money, £335 for the last 3 years in deficit in his office expenses. And such ideas of rapprochement didn't last for long. So he's saying here that he's hoping that Nance and Caradda could cooperate with him to standardize Cornish, each with their own skills. So Nance knew early English, Caradda Welsh, and Hal Wyn French and Russian and German and so on. The rapprochements didn't last for long. So it's a great pity that you should always be writing criticisms, as seems to be your wish, about anything I write in my language. It has for the only effect to aggravate people and does no good at all. You launched an unfair attack about what I did. Arluthachel, High Lord, Great Lord, you are not the owner of the language, neither anyone else. Now, in fairness, Hal Wyn wasn't the only person to find Nance impossible to work with. Even Caradda, who worked with Nance on his dictionary, found him exasperating. And here's a quote by A.S.D. Smith in a letter to another Cornish speaker, Francis Cargeek. He's attempting what is possible only to a trained philologist, namely a reconstruction of the language. Unfortunately, Morden is no linguist, says Caradda, says A.S.D. Smith, has had no training in philology. The result is that some of his reconstructions are simply childish. I've not been allowed to see many, but quite enough to raise grave doubts in my own mind. When I cooperated with him 4 years ago in preparing the English-Cornish part of the dictionary, I took it for granted that his spellings were traditional. I've since found out that this is not the case. And Rod Lyon, in his article, Medieval Romantic or Language Visionary, says that he was very stubborn and alienated the people who were prepared to advise and help him. A.S.D. Smith says, I have the advantage over him that I know several languages fluently, including Welsh, and I've got a good training in philology. Perhaps if Nance had been more flexible to A.S.D. Smith's input, that might have been the better option for the language. Former Grand Bard Hugh Miners said Nance was domineering and always wanted things to go his way. And of course, Nance's attitude to Hal Wyn was again domineering, stubborn, and he wasn't willing to compromise at all. Now, all of the arguing and shutting Hal Wyn away from the revival had a detrimental effect on his health. A number of times in his letters, Hal Wyn complained of stomach aches and so on. In this letter, in the magazine Anwaled, in Breton magazine, was no exception. So it's not a question of an operation, but a weakness of the organs and something that's not yet been put right. Last night, I had to get up about 10 times during the night, so it makes traveling impossible. The doctor reported improvement last Friday after I had the inner massage. Nobody seeing me would say there's anything wrong with me. Now, to get a fuller picture of Hal Wyn, instead of just relying on Trelawney Roberts's panicky view that he'd make the Cornish language a laughingstock, we need to find another source. And that source is John Lagonna. And John Lagonna was a young Welsh nationalist, and he went in his innocence to visit Morton Nance, A.S.D. Smith, Caradar, and Hal Wyn in the late 1930s. And on their second meeting, Ligonier was given a book by Hal Wyn, which turned out to be his copy of the Reverend Robert Williams's Dictionary of Cornish, dating from the 1860s. In giving the dictionary to the Institute of Cornish Studies almost 40 years later, Ligonier wrote an account of his visits to Cornwall and to London. And here he says, the life record of Hal Wyn abounds in mystery. No life record of chronology exists. Now, not everyone's view of Morton Nance was as complimentary as many of those adopting unified in the 1930s. And here Ligonier says, once I heard an eminent Cornish historian refer to Morton as the old fool says. And this was depreciating and self-confident, slighting form of address troubled me markedly. He's saying that at that time in the late 1970s, to Ligonier's mind, nobody was questioning Cornish spelling at all. Nance's unified spelling since 1929 had been the gospel, and that if Morden and Caradar possessed his head, Gwas Michal, Henry Jenner, and Hal Wyn possessed his heart because of the way they approached the language. So Ligonier didn't like this scurrility towards Morton Nance. Now, he's saying here that here are John Ligonier's thoughts about visiting Hal Wyn in the late 1930s and receiving an unexpected present. Let me just... so he died in the later part of 1939, early part of 1940, thought Ligonier. He was in London during 1939 when he visited him in his small, oblong, threadbare room of an office in Fenchurch Street. It was his second visit, and that was when he gave the dictionary to me. I wasn't related to him. I wasn't one of his circle. He had no such circle. His visit was unplanned, that of a young man to an aging man with similar linguistic enthusiasms. A scene can be pictured inside the small, dishevelled Fenchurch Street room, with Hal Wyn standing beside his table of a desk, while on the other side, I, a young man in my late teens, sat with some questions and answers and much attentive listening to a harangue I've mostly forgotten. He was shortish, mousy, unimpressive, then aging. Young, I couldn't guess his age, only that he was old. Suddenly, unexpectedly, he took some sheets of brown paper from a shelf, put 3 large books into them, wrapped the parcel up securely in the brown paper and gave it to me. I was dumbfounded. And later, many years later, he found it was this dictionary. Now, Ligonier opened the parcel 30 years later to find it was Hal Wyn's precious dictionary with lots of notes and so on in from Hal Wyn. For Hal Wyn to have given that to another person indicates to me that then, in 1939, he was giving up on the language. War was quickly approaching. Perhaps he knew there wouldn't be so much opportunity to use the dictionary. Perhaps, as well, he knew that unified Cornish was there to stay, and so the Jennerian Cornish that he preferred was just a lost cause. Now here, Ligonier discusses the claims made by Hal Wyn in his 1930 article in Zeitschrift. So he says that the article states that Hal Wyn's father was a sort of a literary person. And Ligonier's guessed that the whole family moved back to the GB and that Hal Wyn went at least partly to school in the GB. His command of English was fluent. Now, we've heard differently from Nance that he wasn't fluent, but here Ligonier says there was no noticeable foreign accent. His heavily annotated dictionary lexicon, the amendments are in a fluent and even in an idiomatic English. There's not the usual foreign language influence a critic might expect. In the yellow, we can see that he says he was given a long harangue about the Cornish language, rising at one point to the adamance and intensity of tears. So Hal Wyn broke down in front of him. But I don't remember being struck by a foreign accent. The voice was thin and unattractive, but not noticeably accented. So you can see that Hal Wyn was driven to tears by the state
of his mind about what had happened to Cornish over the 1930s. In the orange, although Hal Wyn's origins are none too sure, it would appear that he wasn't known as an enthusiast for the Cornish language before the Trelawney Roberts lecture in the 1920s. His interest in the language waned after the 1929 Outback. Although as late as 1939, I don't remember him talking about any other topic in long discourse. Well, we know that he didn't stop writing after 1929. In fact, most of his material was written after 1929, newspaper articles for the Cornish language Curno magazine, and so on. So not all of what these people are saying is necessarily that correct. Here, he says he lived in a suburb with his aging mother on resources which even in combination were small. His health was poor. He worked with his nose to the grindstone. These straitened circumstances, plus the costly loss of publishing his Cornish grammar, were the reason for his not going to Cornwall. He was elected to the literary committee of the London Cornish Association in 1927, yet there's no record of his ever being in Cornwall. Now, Hal Wyn didn't have the archival material we have today. Perhaps after 30 years, didn't remember clearly, but his claims as to his straitened circumstances must have been apparent to him. However, there are many aspects of Hal Wyn which remain a mystery, and these are discussed by Le Gonner here. If he was brought up in France, France was his first language. Memory could well be playing Hal Wyn a trick here. It seems to be notable that getting the printed article in May 1930, he submitted the article to Morden for the latter's comments, which are clearly to be seen in the original. Now, the article contains 46 traditional words at the end. If they were made up from Breton or elsewhere, why should he submit them to Morden? It's said that Hal Wyn might have obtained them from Tirvab or William Watson, who lived in Penzance. But I understand that Tirvab came from San Creed in the heart of the countryside. But the recorded words evidently describe fish and fishing. The words need close scrutiny. Many baffled Morden. Are they of Breton origin? In fact, are there many unknown words in Hal Wyn's word list of the same origin? Are the article and words alike bogus? Was he a charlatan, if not a crackpot? So you can see Le Gonner, as well as Trelawney Roberts, had many questions to ask, and they weren't necessarily that clear about what Hal Wyn's motives were. Now, here, Le Gonner shows that a Cornish Revival establishment came together to deny Hal Wyn a platform. Now, in the middle, you can see he says the Morden view is vigorously upheld in several places. Carador was a strong Morden supporter. After years of testing the language, Nance has succeeded in evolving a system of spelling which is as near perfect as any system can be. And then in the brown, in 1977, this view has triumphed totally, and no one would seriously want to alter it. In other words, unified was the language which was there to stay. But was it the right one? Has it turned the Cornish language into a museum piece? Dynamic languages don't grow by going backwards. Latin evolved into many varieties, while the old form died out, despite huge efforts of religion and learning to maintain it. The final paragraph of the story of the Cornish language by Carador seems ominous, and one can take heart at the thought of what we write now in Cornish will be as fully intelligible 100 years hence as it is in the present year of grace, 1947. Now, in 1977, 30 years after that was written, that was 10 years before the language was rent asunder into 3 major camps. And the plethora of orthographies has continued to expand until today. And we're in a situation today where there are Cornish is written in 5 major spelling systems, and yet there are only maybe 250, 300 fluent speakers. Now, as we can see, Le Gonner is wrong in saying that Hal Wyn was steadfast in opposing any adaptation to unified Cornish. We know that he wanted to work with Nance right from the beginning in 1925. To the contrary, Hal Wyn wrote most of his stuff in unified from 1930 onwards. as he has stated. For example, his articles in Curno magazine. Okay. So by 1939, in the 1939 register, there is Hal Wyn living in Vincent Square in Westminster, and he is still a translator of foreign languages. Now, his aged mother wasn't living with him and Julie. She was living across the river in Lambeth. She was calling herself Marie de Richemont Allin, still showing the affectation to grandeur we've seen previously in the family. Now, she died at the age of 92 in the end of 1940. Julie was the informant. You can see M.E. Allin-Collins, daughter-in-law, was the informant. So where was Rolf? Well, contained in the Lagona typescript are notes by another correspondent, and that was most likely Talek, or George Ritalick Hooper, the person who took over from Morton. That's his grand bard, and who had learnt to speak Cornish fluently from going to Hal Wyn's lectures in the 1930s. And he said that Allin-Collins was sent by the Secret Service to Liverpool to use his knowledge of Irish and Breton to listen out for troublemakers, because the IRA had begun a bombing campaign in which over 300 bombs targeted infrastructure. And that makes it more likely that Hal Wyn's comments about him working for the Secret Service in World War I were actually correct. Now, Hal Wyn died on the 11th of April, 1948, from heart disease at the age of 70. His estate was worth £1,855, it's about £300,000 in today's money, and it was left to his wife, Julie. And here is his will. In great contrast to the deaths of Caradar and Morton Nance, no newspapers carried any mention of his death, and I've been unable to find any place of burial, despite a lot of searching around London and so on. Julie died 2.5 years later from pneumonia and heart disease, leaving her money to a friend. Again, I've not been able to identify a place of burial. So why did I state at the beginning that Hal Wyn had a profound effect on the future of Cornish? Well, the answer is in this slide, and this attempts to graph the way that spelling systems in Cornish has proliferated. You can see the 3 yellow dots are periods of orthographic change. So the first one at the top was when Nance devised unified Cornish in 1929. By 1988, Ken George had published his own orthography, Common Cornish, or Cynwyd Cemin. Richard Gendel had proposed a return to late Cornish, or modern Cornish in his mind, and then other people wanted to revise unified Cornish. So that was the second period of orthographic change. Now, because Nance wasn't a trained linguist, although he knew an immense amount about the traditional language and could decipher place names and bits of doggerel into coherent Cornish, it was his mistakes that have bedeviled Cornish since. Now, it was recognised very quickly that unified Cornish has its disadvantages, though no one had the stature to stand up to Morton Nance and said, "You're wrong." These are examples from a learner's magazine, Heddiw, in 1958, which attempted to experiment with both spelling and pronunciation, written by Richard Gendel. In his book, Colloquial Does Not Mean Corrupt, Rod Lyon lists the main faults contained within unified Cornish. You can see retention of unstressed vowels, quiescent letters such in spelling such as Bean and Marach. You don't pronounce the GH there. Although, to be fair, Allin-Collins advocated pronouncing GH in a way similar to Welsh. So his pronunciation wasn't that similar to traditional Cornish. There were unwarranted changes in spelling, disregard of more colloquial forms of personal and prepositional pronouns. He disregarded any simplification in prepositional pronouns. His indirect statements were very archaic. He didn't like pre-occlusion, which is where M would turn to DM and N would turn to DN and so on. He recommended unattested dual forms. So, Dulagas, 2 I's, is commonly attested in the text, but he wanted to, Morton Nance wanted dual forms for wrists, knees, elbows, you name it, anything with two of them, and you would have a dual form for it. We could add as also the rejection of the many hundreds of words possibly derived from Anglo-Cornish dialect, and the replacement by many neologisms derived from Welsh and Breton. So Hal Wyn's words were excised from Nance's dictionary. So here we are. By 1985, Tim Saunders had attempted to produce an orthography much closer to Welsh. Rod Lyon had published a book, Everyday Cornish, which brought the language back closer to Jenner's spelling system. In 1986, Ken George published his analysis of the phonemes of Cornish. He developed his own system, Canuic Cemin, or Common Cornish. Rod Lyon's research spurred Richard Gendel, who had previously semi-retired from the language, into producing a spelling system called Modern Cornish, based on the late traditional form. Some speakers didn't want to abandon unified Cornish. Others thought that a few minor tweaks would suffice, so Nicholas Williams developed this into his Unified Cornish Revised. And the period between 1987 and 2008 became known as spelling wars, because the debate became so heated, even up to the point of anonymous attacks, disruption of other groups' meetings, and many people left the language movement altogether. Eventually, the promise of government recognition and money brought everyone together to cobble together a standard written form. Even so, the lack of compromise between the camps meant that even this had 4 variants. And you can see that you get ones based in Middle Cornish and ones based in Late Cornish, with either main graphs, that's based on Common Cornish, so KW and HW, or the traditional graphs are WH and using QU or a C for the K sound. And now Nicholas Williams didn't concur with the compromises made in developing the standard written form. He developed his own orthography, Canuic Standard. So there's now 5 main spelling systems, and all of them are now used in Cornish. You can see the 5 coloured arrows down towards the bottom. Now, since each system has its own orthographic baggage in terms of pronunciation, what vocabulary is recommended, so dictionaries will say, this is found in the text, but use this instead. And in terms of the grammatical constructs, the debates have continued. And as you can see, even though most learners might use standard written form Middle Cornish main graphs, it's only 26% of what's actually written in the language in the last 15 years. Any meaningful discussion between Morton Nance and others might have put Cornish on a firmer footing. As we found out from letters, Nance knew early English. Allin-Collins spoke 8 or 9 languages fluently and had a working knowledge of several others. A.S.D. Smith Carada was a trained classicist and linguist. He wrote a textbook for learning Welsh. Peggy Pollard, who learnt Cornish towards the end of the 1930s, was a brilliant Sanskrit scholar. Between them all, with give and take, they had the necessary expertise to actually produce something that would have lasted. So, was Hal Wyn any of these epithets given him by the various observers? Was he a native speaker? Now, the answer to that, from me, is almost certainly no. I think it's inconceivable that John Henry Allin, Ralph's father, spoke any Cornish as a native tongue, considering where he lived in Cornwall. However, all of Ralph's statements that we've been able to find evidence for confirm as truths or lies, evidence to confirm as truths or lies, have turned out to be true. There might have been some romanticism associated with some of them, and some egging it on, but Hal Wyn consistently kept to the story that he'd been taught some Cornish as a boy from 1927, and he said this from 1927 onwards. What's also evident is that both his father and mother's families like to over-egg and embellish their stories and their names. St Vincent for Vincent, de Richemont for Richmond, for example. And Hal Wyn showed he was cut from the same cloth by his adoption of the name Collins when he married. It seems probable that John Henry had learned some Cornish when he self-educated, and he passed a few words on to his son, enough for him to remember 45 years later when Trelawney Roberts gave his lecture in London. Hal Wyn's letters to Morton Nance and John Lagona's testimony point not to a charlatan or an impostor,
but to someone who'd given a good part of his life and earnings to Cornish, who'd been harshly treated by others in the revival, who either didn't understand him or were too stubborn or unwilling to cooperate for the good of the language. Now, the same lack of willingness to cooperate and compromise has bedeviled the language, not just in the 1930s, but in the 1980s, when there were 3 competing orthographies and people wouldn't listen to anyone else's arguments. And in 2008, when, because of a lack of compromise, we've got 4 different versions of a standard written form. When people carried on using their previous systems anyway, and when Canonic Standard was launched. So of all of these epithets, it seems to me that it's E.G.R. Hooper's assessment of him which was closest to the truth. Hooper had, after all, learnt some of his Cornish in Hal Wyn's conversation classes held at his offices in Fenchurch Street. And these days, the words that Hal Wyn bemoaned had been left out of Nance's dictionary have been included in other dictionaries, although not by every spelling system. Some of his writings are being published on the web for all learners to see. Perhaps at last, Hal Wyn is getting some of the credit due to him as a tireless worker for the language for so many years, and for showing learners that Cornish was a language that could be spoken once again and used in modern literature. Right. Okay, well, thank you very much for that. I hope you enjoyed hearing about Hal Wyn. He's a very complex figure, but yes, there's most of this hasn't been published before, so hopefully Hal Wyn become more of a known figure in the Cornish language revival.